In Lab 2, we're exploring the GNOME desktop environment running on the AM3517. In Part B, we'll start GNOME from the command line of a Linux terminal after booting the AM3517 board in a text-only. In Lab 2B, we're going to do exactly what we just did in Lab 2A, except instead of doing it via the command line, or I should say the boot arguments that we're passing to the Linux kernel, we're going to do it manually via the command line. So we're still not really in the practical phase of this lab, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of background on the different elements that are involved in the GNOME Display Manager. So you can see the main two steps are we're going to do start X to start the X11 server. The X11 server basically exposes the display, which in our case is the LCD display. It actually exposes it on the network. We're not going to be talking to it over the network quite yet. That's what we're going to get to in the next lab. But you can talk to it, as you might guess, locally as well. So the X11 server, again, is just going to expose the display to the rest of the system. And the GNOME Display Manager is actually a client in this way that is going to serve, the X11 server is going to serve the display to the GNOME client, which is going to then put data on the display. So it's a little backwards perhaps than what intuition would tell you, but that's the terminology at least that's commonly used. So once we've started the X11 server, then all we need to do is start a GNOME session using this command, and then we're going to pass it an argument, the display equals, and this localhost 0.0 just says to use the default display in the local environment. Localhost could be replaced by an IP address, for instance, as we'll see in the next lab. So here we once again power cycle the board and start up. We don't need to pause the countdown of U-boot, because remember that even though we made that change to the boot arguments in the last lab, they have not been saved locally. So we're back to what the default was, which was to put the text keyword in the boot arguments. With that text keyword, we're not going to have any type of display on the AM3517 board when it boots. We will just have this text terminal talking into the system. So once that boot procedure completes, again you'll notice right here not starting the GNOME Display Manager because we found text in the kernel command line. So we can go ahead and log in. As a matter of fact, before we do that, let me just show you what the board looks like right now. At this point, you should see nothing on the LCD. So once we log in, root with no password, what we can do to begin is start the X11 server, which is as simple as running the start X command with an ampersand. Now the ampersand is going to say to run this command in the background so that we get another command prompt at the terminal. If we didn't do this, then when we started X, we would be basically locked out of the terminal until we hit Control-C to exit X11. So I'll go ahead and do that. You see quite a bit of feedback that comes up here. Even though you see a couple of warnings and failures, this is normal. And then let's take another look back here at the board. Now I press enter, and X11 will show up on the LCD. Now you notice we don't have a command prompt, but if you just press enter, then that'll take us back to a command prompt. And then to start up the GNOME session, we could just run the GNOME session command. We're going to do this manually. It would assume the localhost and default display. But just to show this, let's go ahead and put it in manually so that we're being explicit. And then again, localhost is just an alias for the IP address of the local host, the local running Linux, and then 0.0 is the is the default display and the default screen, I believe, on the display. So basically, by putting localhost 0.0, we're just saying whatever your default display for the local system is, then run it. And at this point, we can run the GNOME session. Again, you'll see a couple warnings. Linux tends to do a lot in the way of feedback. But you can see this as, if you will, normal behavior for starting the GNOME session. If we take a look now over at the development board, this time when I press enter, the GNOME desktop will boot. Now, once we're done playing around with GNOME, if I simply press Control-C at the terminal, then you can see it now going through a shutdown on GDM. And if we just hit return, we have access back on the terminal in a text fashion.